I'm going to talk to you about Dwight D. Eisenhower, giving you some very general highlights. We'll start with a bio leading up to his presidency. Then we'll mention the war in Korea, the Second Red Scare, contributions to civil rights, and some of his Cold War positioning via his foreign policy initiative called the New Look. Dwight D. Eisenhower was born David Dwight Eisenhower in 1890 in a rented room by some railroad tracks in Denison, Texas. So he was named for his dad, and as a result, he always went by his middle name, Dwight. We know him as Dwight D. Eisenhower because I think he just got tired of explaining it. By the time he went to West Point, he was signing his middle name as his first name, just to clear up confusion. And by the way, when he goes to West Point, in case I forget to say this later on, his mother, who was a committed pacifist and a very religious woman, cried because she did not want any of her sons to be soldiers. Anyway, Eisenhower does not come from money. His dad had dropped out of college to marry his mother, and he actually started a general store with a business partner. That business partner cleared out all the bank accounts at some point and left Dwight D. Eisenhower's dad holding the bag, which pushed the family into bankruptcy. This was hugely humiliating, and as a result, the family would not use credit. Eisenhower Sr. always said that you needed to use cash after that point because he never wanted to be in that situation again. The Eisenhowers will never be a wealthy family, even though the senior Eisenhower will work later as a mechanic and then become a gas company manager, which is all very good and a little bit closer in the middle class. I would say middle class at some point. But when Dwight D. Eisenhower was growing up, he had to wear lots of hand-me-downs. There were 6 boys. He got made fun of all the time because his clothes were a little bit raggedy. Sometimes he even wore his mother's hand-me-down shoes, had to. There wasn't enough money. And what did this do? It made all of the Eisenhower boys pretty scrappy because they had to kind of stand up for themselves. So he doesn't have a privileged life. He admired leaders like George Washington as he was growing up, but he also did not want to he didn't have any vision of being like this great military commander. He wanted to be a railroad engineer when he was a kid, but he went to West Point because it was free and he didn't have a lot of money. So that was an avenue to kind of raise his situation. And he wasn't really into academics, by the way. He liked sports a lot more. He played football, but he hurts his knee playing against Tufts University in 1912, and that's actually going to shift his focus in athletics. He's going to be a lifetime avid golfer. That's one of those things that Dwight D. Eisenhower is always known for. You always see him in pictures playing golf while he's president. He did become a professional soldier, again, against his mother's wishes, but he did not go overseas during World War I. By 1932, he was part of Douglas MacArthur's staff. He was MacArthur's aide during the Bonus Marcher incident, though he never liked MacArthur very much. By World War II, he was a brigadier general. He became the Supreme Allied Commander who oversaw Operation Overlord, which you may think of more as D-Day. He was going to replace George Marshall as the Army Chief of Staff after the war, because George Marshall will go on and become Harry Truman's Secretary of State. He thought nuclear bombs were dreadful. He thought that the damage in Japan was horrific, but he also felt that nuclear bombs could serve as a deterrent to having another war like World War II, and he wanted to do everything he could to stop World War III. So some other highlights from his life: after he retired from the military, he did become the president of Columbia University for a couple of years, and then he was kind of called back into a sort of military service as the Supreme Commander of NATO. Truman recruited him in 1952 to run for president as Democrat. But this is the thing: people in the military keep their politics really close to their sleeve because you're all serving a commander-in-chief regardless of what political party he represents, and he's the guy in charge. So Truman is trying to get him to run as a Democrat, but he was a Republican, so he ran as a Republican. He ran, now keep in mind, in the early 1950s, at the end of Truman's second administration, we are fighting under a UN banner in Korea. So part of Eisenhower's platform was that he would go to Korea and he would figure out how to get peace there. Also, I want you to kind of think about how Eisenhower's military service plays into something else that Truman did. Truman issued an executive order that integrated the military. Truman had been a captain during World War I. Eisenhower was a supreme Allied commander. So I think he had a little bit more authority to do this. You also need to understand that executive orders can be reversed by the next president. Eisenhower doesn't do that. He really oversees the integration of the military, and I think that is to his credit. Anyway, he swept the election in 1952, except in the Deep South, because in the Deep South, they're all Democrats. His vice president was Nixon, who would serve kind of as an attack dog for him throughout his two administrations. And what does he do in Korea? Well, something happens that's really important. It kind of changes how the chessboard looks. Joseph Stalin dies a miserable death. Joseph Stalin dies, and this will lessen Soviet support for Mao. Ike will then threaten China with nuclear bombs and maybe unleashing Chiang Kai-shek to go into the mainland to kind of push them to the negotiating table. Ike didn't really want nuclear war. Well, he's trying to push the North Koreans, but he doesn't want the involvement of Mao. He does get an armistice by 1953, and that is very important. So Korea is then split into North Korea and South Korea. I have a separate lecture about Korea if you want to know more about that. So the second Red Scare was ongoing when Eisenhower came into office, and you need to understand what that was all about. Communism had started to look good to a lot of Americans in the 1930s because of the Great Depression. And of course, we allied with the communists during World War II. So there were Americans who were communists. But at the beginning of the Cold War, communists started to look really dangerous again. And that's because you had come to light spies like Alger Hiss and Klaus Fuchs and the Rosenbergs, all of whom gave information from the Manhattan Project to the Soviets. The Soviets had a nuclear weapon. All of these things are a big threat. So there is a Republican senator from the great state of Wisconsin. His name was Joseph McCarthy, sometimes called Tail Gunner Joe because he served in World War II, but he lied about a whole bunch of the stuff that he did. So Tail Gunner Joe could be used derisively against him. Anyway, he gives a speech to some ladies. He has a list of communists. He says these guys are all in the government and, they need to be uprooted. And this speech goes gangbusters. And then all of a sudden, this list of communists will switch and change the numbers, who's on it. He'll never tell you exactly who that is. But he'll get into a position of power looking for communists, and he will sometimes target people that he doesn't like. And he will literally destroy people. When we decide that communism isn't good, that's good. Just like racism isn't good, but you don't then destroy people, right? You don't target them. Like, what is the worst thing you can call someone today? It's a racist, right? Be careful when you levy these words against other people. It can be very Red Scare-like. When McCarthy said you're a communist, everything could be taken away from you. Your livelihood, your reputation, everything. And was everyone a communist? Anyway, when Eisenhower became president, he said he agreed with McCarthy's goals. Communists are a problem, but he does not agree with McCarthy's methods. Racism is a problem, but can you see that parallel? Can you just think about that? I'm trying to give you something that you might understand from today. So anyway, he waited for Joseph McCarthy to destroy himself. He doesn't talk about McCarthy publicly, though privately he says that's because he doesn't want to get into a pissing contest with a skunk. And he will also work privately against McCarthy. One day, McCarthy does really destroy himself. He's on television, and he looks like a bully as he holds some hearings. And this will lead to the Joe Must Go movement. And he starts pointing at people who are way too high. He's like, George Marshall is a communist. George Marshall was not a communist. eventually the senators and he's going to be censured by his peers, and this is going to break him politically, but it's also going to break him spiritually. And on this, I actually do find McCarthy a very tragic figure. He was a heavy drinker. He dies in 1957 at 48, which is really quite young. Anyway, during Dwight Eisenhower's tenure, the civil rights movement also begins. The civil rights movement. Now, there's steps in civil rights all along the way. I mean, we've talked about Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois in the past, and that was way long ago. So I don't want you to think that no one's been working for civil rights, but the civil rights movement starts with a court case called Brown v. Board of Education, and that is because the ruling in that strikes the first really big blow at Jim Crow. And I will talk more about that in detail elsewhere. I'll give you other material so you can look into that. Now, Eisenhower is sometimes dinged for not liking Brown v. Board, and that is true, but it's not because he liked segregation. It's because he did not like the courts changing the laws. He wanted Congress to change the laws. He saw that as judicial activism, even though he was the guy who put the Supreme Court Chief Justice Earl Warren into place, who will really persuade his fellow justices to vote Brown v. Board, that segregation is inherently unequal. So Brown v. Board is so significant because it overturns Plessy v. Ferguson from 1896, which you have heard about and thought about in the past. So anyway, Eisenhower doesn't like judicial activism, but he will uphold the ruling. He will send military troops to support the Little Rock Nine in Arkansas as they're trying to integrate schools. He will also put his money where his mouth is. He wants Congress to act. So he puts forth the 1957 Civil Rights Act, which was the first major civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. Now, it's going to get all kinds of watered down, especially by Southern Democrats, because they are segregationists. And, you know, the president is not the guy who ushers these things through Congress, but he supported it. Eisenhower supported the 1957 Civil Rights Act. This was an important step. Okay, so I'll talk about all that stuff elsewhere. But the big thing that you also need to keep in mind is in the 1950s, the Cold War is raging. So what does Eisenhower do about that? Well, he builds up the nuclear arsenal because, again, he thought nuclear bombs would be a good deterrent. If you've ever heard that idiom, more bang for the buck, this comes from the Eisenhower era. He thought that you got more bang for your buck if you bought a nuclear bomb rather than built up an army. His foreign policy was called the New Look. And that is because it looks different than what happened under Truman. He's going to stress not only the building up of the nuclear arsenal, but covert operations in foreign countries. He does not want to see clashes of armies like in World War I and World War II. So he will put people like covert operators abroad to try and gather American influence, which includes, you know, the CIA maybe starting a revolution here or there along the way. At home, he's going to stress things that make communism look bad to Americans culturally. For example, the U.S. currency that we have, In God We Trust, had appeared before, but that's going to appear on all of our U.S. currency after Eisenhower, and that is because he wants to show Americans look at something that is higher than government. He doesn't say which God. It's stressing the idea of inalienable rights coming outside of government. In his second inaugural, Eisenhower said, quote, "We view our nation's strength and security as a trust upon which rests the hope of free men everywhere," end quote. Lyndon Baines Johnson will say these sturdy and elegant virtues, honor, courage, integrity, decency, all found elegant expression in the life of this good man and noble leader, end quote. So that's some Eisenhower.